Have you ever stopped and wondered what really makes someone a person? I mean, like, what gives any of us the right to life? And why does that even matter? Well, today, we're diving into some history, some culture, and yeah, some really intense stories that show why understanding personhood isn't just philosophy, it's about real lives. And here's the thing, this isn't just about the past, it's about the choices we face today and how they could shape the future. So stick around, because it's eye-opening. So let's talk about Christian resistance and, why it's kind of a big deal, historically speaking. I mean, most people today might think of resistance as this, modern political thing, right? But the reality is, the church has always been in this kind of push and pull with culture. From the very beginning, after Christ's ascension, the followers of Jesus didn't just sit back and wait for the world to become nicer or more moral. They were thrown into cultures that were, honestly, pretty wild by today's standards. I mean, think about it. Civilizations across the world, Aztecs, Mayans, Egyptians, you name it, had practices that would make us, gasp today. Sacrificing children, ritualistic killings, burning people, or worshiping gods through literally terrifying ceremonies. And in most of these societies, these practices weren't rare. They were completely normal. That's what Christians were walking into. And here's the thing, early believers weren't just quietly practicing their faith in a corner. They actively confronted these systems. They challenged the cultural norms, the gods, the accepted behaviors that were fundamentally harmful, that dehumanized people, that celebrated death and cruelty as entertainment or religious duty. It wasn't some abstract fight. It was about life, dignity, and protecting the vulnerable. Now, I don't want to oversimplify, but the early church fathers, the missionaries, the martyrs, they were literally standing against the mainstream culture of their times. And I mean, think about it. When you walk into a culture where it's normal to sacrifice a child or to glorify sexual immorality as part of religion, you have a choice. You can either conform, blend in, or you can resist. And historically, the church chose to resist. They would not participate. They would speak out, and they often faced extreme consequences for doing so. This is why even today, we see echoes of this same pattern. Christian resistance is about standing firm, often in a hostile environment, and saying, no, this is not right. This is not what God intended. This is harmful, and it needs to change. I think one of the most important things to understand here is that resistance isn't just about opposing evil in a reactive way. It's proactive. It's about culture shaping. Christians didn't just protest, they offered alternatives. They established schools, hospitals, and systems of care. They created societies within societies that modeled a different way of living. And over time, these communities, tiny as they might have seemed at first, had massive influence. Because when you consistently resist the culture in a principled, moral way, and you live out an alternative, it starts to create ripple effects. And yeah, that can take centuries. It's slow, it's messy, and it's often invisible until you look back and realize, wow, this small resistance movement actually changed everything around it. Let's bring this closer to specific examples. Take, for instance, the practice of human sacrifice among the Aztecs and Mayans. These civilizations weren't evil in some cartoonish way. They had fully developed societies with complex social systems, economies, and religions. But as part of their religious practice, they believed that offering human lives was necessary to keep the sun moving or to appease their gods. And here's where Christians come in. Early missionaries, often risking their own lives, confronted these practices head on. They didn't just say, "That's bad, stop it." They went into these communities, preached a radically different message about the value of every human life. And over time, they changed the hearts and minds of people. Slowly, the tide turned. The idea that human life was sacred started to take root. Or look at ancient Rome. Rome had a whole set of normalized brutalities that, to us today, are unthinkable. Gladiator games, mass executions, and a legal system that treated life as expendable depending on social class. And yet, Christians stood firm. They refused to participate in gladiator games. They refused to offer up their children to pagan practices. And they formed tight-knit communities that lived according to God's standards rather than the world's. Over time, their persistence contributed to cultural shifts, which eventually helped Rome transition toward values that more closely aligned with the idea of human dignity and justice. Now, It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but the pattern is there. Consistent moral resistance, even in the face of widespread opposition, can change the culture. Here's something I love about looking at history this way. It shows that culture wars aren't new. People sometimes act like, oh, modern culture is uniquely chaotic or depraved. But if you actually step back and read history, every generation has faced its own set of challenges. Christians have always had to navigate that tension. How do you engage with a culture that celebrates things that are objectively harmful while still loving people and trying to change hearts? And the answer has usually been the same: courage, conviction, and yes, sometimes confrontation. That's what Christian resistance has always been about. And it's not just about ancient history. There are modern examples that mirror this pattern too. Think about movements within the last century where Christian activists confronted systemic evils, things like slavery, human trafficking, or oppressive totalitarian regimes. In every case, you see the same formula: principled resistance, often by small, dedicated groups, which eventually ripples outward and produces broader change. It's a long game, but it works. And what's fascinating is seeing how these historical roots inform today's Christian activism. The church hasn't changed its core role. It's still called to stand up for the vulnerable, challenge injustice, and resist cultural pressures that compromise moral truths. Now, let's pause for a second and consider the mindset required for this kind of resistance. You can't approach it casually. You can't say, well, I'll resist, but only when it's convenient. True Christian resistance requires awareness, education, and courage. You have to know what's going on culturally, understand the forces at play, and recognize the stakes. Because if you don't, you might resist in ways that are ineffective. Or worse, you might fail to resist when it really matters. That's why learning history is so critical. When you know the patterns, the past heroes, the moral victories, and even the failures, you're better equipped to navigate today's challenges. And here's the thing about continuity: the same principles that guided Christians resisting cultural evils in ancient times are still relevant today. The enemies might look different, the methods of oppression might be subtler, but the fundamental question is the same. How do you uphold truth and life in the face of a culture that sometimes promotes the opposite? It's not about adopting a combative personality or being confrontational for the sake of it. It's about living faithfully, speaking truth, and modeling an alternative that shows a better way. It's about being, in every generation, a moral conscience for your society. So, when we think about Christian resistance historically, it's not just a series of heroic tales. It's a framework for understanding how faith interacts with culture. It's about standing up against the things that devalue human life, challenging cultural norms that are destructive, and consistently advocating for principles that honor God and protect people. And what's remarkable is how this thread weaves through centuries, from the early church facing Roman cruelty to missionaries confronting extreme practices in distant civilizations, all the way to today's discussions about moral and cultural issues. It's a continuous narrative of courage, conviction, and moral clarity. And you know, it's actually kind of inspiring when you see it that way. Because it reminds us that standing up for what's right isn't some new, scary thing. It's what the church has always done. It's what believers have always been called to do. And the lessons from history are clear. Consistency, knowledge, courage, and faithfulness matter. They change the world, even if it takes time. And yeah, sometimes the victories aren't immediate. Sometimes they're messy, but the impact is real. And that, honestly, is what gives the pro-life movement and Christian activism more broadly a deep sense of purpose. It's not just reacting to the world, it's engaging it with a clear moral vision that has roots going back thousands of years. So, when we talk about Christian resistance today, we're talking about continuing that legacy. We're talking about facing modern challenges with the same courage and clarity, knowing that there's a long historical line of believers who stood firm and often changed the course of history by doing so. And the more we understand that history, the more equipped we are to face our own time. It's about learning, standing, speaking, and acting, all while keeping in mind that the stakes are enormous, because culture shapes people, and resisting cultural evils isn't just theoretical. It saves lives, protects the vulnerable, and preserves truth. And that, right there, is why Christian resistance isn't just an interesting historical concept. It's essential, timeless, and still urgently relevant today. Alright, so let's dive into one of the most incredible stories of moral courage from the 20th century, the White Rose Resistance in Munich, Germany, during 1942 and 1943. Now, if you've never heard of this before, you're in for a story that's part thrilling, part heartbreaking, and honestly a little mind-blowing. This wasn't some organized military unit or a band of hardened revolutionaries. These were ordinary young people, students, really in their late teens and early 20s, who looked around at their world and said, "This is wrong. We have to do something." And they actually did. Let's start with the main figures, because these aren't faceless names in a history book. They were real people, full of energy, curiosity, and the kind of courage that you just don't come across every day. Sophie Scholl was 21 years old. Her brother Hans was 24. Then you had Christoph Probst, Alexander Schmorell, Willy Graf, and a handful of others in the same age range. Just think about that for a second. 21, 24, they were basically our age, or maybe a few years older, trying to figure out life in a world that was completely upside down morally. And what made them extraordinary wasn't just their youth. It was that they looked around at Nazi Germany and recognized the sheer evil of what was happening, and they refused to be silent. It's so easy to feel powerless when systems of oppression are massive, but these kids decided to act anyway. Now, what did they actually do? Well, it sounds simple at first, handing out leaflets, spray painting graffiti, but the reality is, it was incredibly dangerous. They created and distributed anti-Nazi leaflets, hundreds of them, that challenged the regime, criticized Hitler, and called on ordinary citizens to wake up to what was happening around them. One of the leaflets famously said things like, "We are your bad conscience. We will not leave you in peace." Imagine writing something like that in a place where doing so could, and did, cost your life. And they didn't just sit in some quiet room handing out pamphlets to friends. No, they went out into public. They left leaflets in university classrooms, in public spaces, under doors, in telephone booths. They were deliberately making sure that people would see the truth, even if only for a moment, even if it scared them. And here's the dramatic part. They also painted graffiti. They spray painted the words "Down with Hitler" on buildings in Munich. Now, I know, some of us might think, well, spray painting is a small act, right? But in that context, that was life-threatening. In Nazi Germany, any act of defiance could get you executed. There was no trial like we imagine today. No lengthy appeals process. You got caught, and it could very well be the end. Yet they did it anyway. And here's what's chilling. The authorities had no idea who was behind these actions for months. These kids were invisible ghosts in a city under one of the most ruthless regimes in modern history. So, let's talk about the turning point. On February 18th, 1943, they staged a leaflet drop at the University of Munich. Hans and Sophie Scholl, along with Christoph Probst, left stacks of leaflets for students and faculty to find, carefully placing them in corridors, classrooms, and common areas. They were meticulous, careful, and still, can you imagine the adrenaline? Every footstep could be the one that ends it all. And sure enough, a janitor spotted them and reported them to the Gestapo. Just 4 days later, Sophie, Hans, and Christoph were arrested. Can you even imagine the terror in those moments? They were so young. They had hope. They had ideals. And suddenly, their lives were completely in the hands of a totalitarian machine that showed no mercy. The consequences were immediate and brutal. 4 days after that leaflet drop, they were executed, beheaded, just like that. And over the following months, the rest of their group, the others who had participated in the distribution of leaflets, the planning, the writing, were rounded up and killed. Most of them were still in their 20s. These weren't hardened political activists who had been fighting for decades. These were students. And yet, they faced unimaginable risk and paid the ultimate price because they chose to stand up for what they believed was right. And here's where the story gets even more compelling, because you can't help but feel the weight of their courage. They were aware of the danger. They knew full well that if they were caught, they could and likely would be executed. And yet, they still pressed forward. That's the essence of moral conviction, isn't it? When you understand the stakes, when you know the cost, and you still choose to act because it's the right thing to do. It's not about recklessness, it's about the courage to act when most people are too afraid to move. And it's worth pausing to think about that, because courage like this doesn't show up every day, and when it does, it often reshapes history. Now, here's a subtle point that's easy to miss, but really important. The White Rose Resistance wasn't trying to win a military battle. They weren't trying to overthrow the Nazi regime with force. They didn't have the manpower, the weapons, or the means to do that. Their fight was intellectual, moral, and spiritual. It was about awakening the conscience of their fellow citizens. They wanted people to see the truth, to understand that the world they were living in had become morally bankrupt, and to make a choice, even if small, to resist. And that's part of what makes this story timeless, because when you look at the way culture shifts, the real battles are often fought in hearts and minds, not just on streets or battlefields. I want you to picture this. Munich in 1942. The city is under strict Nazi control. Propaganda is everywhere. The press, the schools, the media, everything reinforces the idea that Hitler is infallible, that the regime is unstoppable, that dissent is unthinkable. And yet, a few young students decide that truth matters more than their own safety. They write words, they distribute leaflets, they paint graffiti, and those small, brave acts create a ripple that echoes beyond their deaths. Today, historians look back and recognize the White Rose not just as a footnote, but as a symbol of conscience, courage, and moral clarity. And honestly, there's a lesson here that resonates even now. You see, cultural battles aren't just about governments or political parties. They're about ideas, values, and the willingness to stand up when the crowd is silent. The White Rose reminds us that standing against what's wrong isn't easy, and it's rarely safe. It's often lonely. And yet, that's exactly what changes the course of history. When a few people refuse to accept the moral corruption around them, when they act out of principle rather than self-interest, they create a standard, a conscience, that challenges everyone else to rethink their choices. I also want to highlight the humanity of these individuals. Sophie, Hans, Christoph, Willie, Alexander. They weren't saints. They were humans with doubts, fears, and dreams. And yet, in a society that normalized hatred, violence, and dehumanization, they chose love, justice, and truth. They chose to risk their lives not for fame, not for power, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. That's the kind of courage that sticks with you when you read history. And it makes you pause and ask yourself, what would you do in their place? Would you have the clarity, the conviction, the bravery to act when it really mattered? Another part of what makes their story so compelling is the way their message was framed. They didn't just rant against the Nazis, they appealed to the conscience of ordinary Germans. They used reason, morality, and faith as their weapons. They called out injustice, yes, but they also urged reflection. And that's why their leaflets still resonate today. The language they used wasn't angry or hateful, it was principled, courageous, and human. And that's an important distinction because it shows that resistance doesn't have to be violent to be powerful. Sometimes, the quiet act of standing up, of speaking truth, is more dangerous than any gun and far more lasting. And yeah, let's just acknowledge the heartbreak for a second. These young people gave their lives, not for immediate victory, but for a principle, for the conscience of their nation, for the future. They didn't know if their actions would make a difference. They couldn't foresee that decades later, people like you and me would be talking about them, learning from them, inspired by them. And that's the point. Courage isn't about seeing instant results. It's about doing what's right, regardless of the outcome, trusting that truth and justice will eventually make an impact. And here's a subtle but critical takeaway. The white rose shows us that age, size, or resources don't determine the capacity for resistance. These were ordinary students, yet their moral clarity and willingness to act created a legacy that has lasted generations. That's the kind of example that's so relevant when we think about our own time. Cultural battles today may not involve Nazi Germany, but the principle remains. There are moments when silence is complicity, when action is the only moral option, and when standing firm requires courage that feels almost unreasonable. And it's in those moments that ordinary people can become extraordinary. So, to wrap up this part of the story, the White Rose Resistance is more than just a historical episode. It's a beacon of moral courage, a reminder that standing up for truth often comes at a high cost, and that even the smallest acts of conscience can have a ripple effect far beyond what anyone could imagine. Sophie, Hans, Christoph, Willie, Alexander, they risked everything because they believed in the sanctity of life and the responsibility to act against injustice. And even though they were executed, their story lives on, inspiring future generations to recognize that culture is not static, that evil is not inevitable, and that moral clarity and courage can and do make a difference. And honestly, when you look at modern society, it's hard not to see some parallels, right? The questions they faced, the courage they exhibited, the stakes for standing up to cultural corruption. They're not just historical footnotes. They're lessons, a challenge, and a call to action that, in many ways, still echo today. Okay, so let's talk about the 1916 Project. And honestly, it's one of those things that when you first hear about it, you're like, wait, what? What is this? How does this even connect to the church? And why does it matter? Well, here's the story. The 1916 Project was born out of a recognition that the church, historically, has a ton of knowledge and wisdom about culture, morality, and human life. But so much of it has been, frankly, forgotten or ignored. And the founders of this project realized that if the church was going to reclaim its role as a moral compass in society, it needed a tool, a way to educate, inspire, and inform believers about the deep historical and cultural roots behind the issues we face today, especially abortion, the sexual revolution, and what's often called cultural Marxism. The project is named provocatively as a counterpoint to the 1619 Project, which many people know is a controversial historical reinterpretation of America's past with a specific focus on slavery and systemic oppression. The 1916 Project, in contrast, focuses on life, human dignity, and the moral and spiritual consequences of ideas that have shaped modern culture. The creators wanted to show that to understand why our society is the way it is today. You can't just look at current events or politics. You've got to trace the lineage of ideas, policies, and cultural shifts. And, yeah, it's a bit of a history lesson, but not in that boring lecture-y way. It's storytelling, it's narrative, it's connecting the dots in a way that hits you in the gut and makes you think, oh wow, I never saw it like that before. So how did this actually get started? Well, the creators were motivated by what they saw as a moral and educational vacuum. They recognized that most churches weren't talking about the roots of abortion, or the sexual revolution, or even the ideological forces that underpin modern social movements. And they said, wait, if we don't fill this gap, who will? So they created a film, a documentary, that could reach people in a way that reading a book or attending a lecture might not. It's designed to be accessible, engaging, and honestly, a little bit provocative. Not to shock for the sake of shock, but to make people sit up, pay attention, and really think about what's happening in culture and why it matters from a moral standpoint. The film itself walks through a lot of history, starting with foundational ideas that influenced abortion and sexual ethics in the United States and beyond. It explores the connection between early 20th century eugenics movements, influential figures like Margaret Sanger, and the ways in which those ideas flowed into policy, education, and public perception. And it doesn't stop there. It goes further, tracing the sexual revolution, the rise of cultural Marxism, and the philosophical and ideological forces that have challenged traditional understandings of human dignity, personhood, and family. And all of this is done with a narrative voice that's, human and engaging, not like reading a history textbook. It's the kind of storytelling that makes you lean forward, like, Oh, I did not know that. Or wait, that connects to today. Seriously? Now, the connection to the church is central. The project isn't just about history for history's sake. It's about equipping the church to engage with culture more effectively. It's about understanding the roots of ideas so that believers can respond thoughtfully, courageously, and strategically. You can't just say abortion is wrong without understanding why it's become normalized, why it's legal, why it's even celebrated in some parts of society. The 1916 Project helps the church see the bigger picture, to connect the moral dots, and to understand that these issues aren't isolated. They're part of a larger ideological movement that has been unfolding for decades. And that, honestly, was something a lot of people hadn't realized before watching the film. Speaking of people, the reception of the film has been, well, pretty remarkable. The screening started in mid-June, and within 6 months, there were almost 1,000 churches involved. That's massive! And get this, one of the filmmakers, Seth, only attended 13 of those screenings himself. The project spread almost organically because the content resonated with people, and the feedback, it was consistent. Viewers were shocked at how much history they had never learned, how the pieces fit together, and how little the church was discussing these things. People would say things like, "I've never heard any of this before," or "I had no idea how connected abortion, the sexual revolution, and cultural Marxism really are." That response, by the way, was exactly what the creators hoped for. It wasn't about shocking people or making them feel guilty. It was about giving them understanding so they could act, think, and respond in their own communities. And here's an interesting point. The project's timing was almost providential. The contrast with the 1619 Project made people think, wait a second, there's another side of history we haven't been taught. The film's low-budget, grassroots nature also made it feel authentic. It wasn't some big, flashy Hollywood production. It was a message driven by conviction, not spectacle. And that authenticity, combined with a compelling narrative, made people trust it and engage with it. Churches were hosting multiple screenings. Some weekends had over 60 events happening simultaneously, and the discussions afterward were often deep, personal, and reflective. People weren't just passively watching, they were talking, debating, sharing insights, and thinking about how these historical ideas shape the world they live in now. The film also does something that's kind of subtle but powerful. It highlights the heroes and thinkers who have resisted cultural decay across history. It's not just about pointing fingers or painting a bleak picture of society. It's about showing that there are individuals and movements that stood up, spoke truth, and made a difference. For example, it touches on figures like Mildred Jefferson, the first black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School, who became a passionate pro-life advocate and influenced Ronald Reagan. Stories like hers are woven into the narrative to show that courage and conviction have real consequences, and that they can shift society in meaningful ways. And this isn't distant history. It's very much connected to the moral and cultural choices facing people today. One thing that viewers keep mentioning is how eye-opening it is to see the links between seemingly separate events and ideas. You watch the film and you start connecting the dots yourself. Eugenics movements in the early 20th century, the founding of Planned Parenthood, the sexual revolution, the philosophical underpinnings of cultural Marxism, and even contemporary policy debates. And when it's presented like that, in a way that's clear, engaging, and grounded in history, it changes the way you think. People start to see, oh, it's not just politics. It's not just a debate over laws. There's an entire worldview shaping these issues, and understanding that worldview is crucial if we want to engage meaningfully. Another cool aspect is how the project empowers the audience. It's not just doom and gloom. It's also about agency. By showing the history, the patterns, and the key figures who resisted evil, viewers get a sense that they too can engage in their communities, churches, or families in ways that make a difference. It's like, yeah, history is heavy, some of it is tragic, but the takeaway isn't despair, it's motivation. You start asking yourself, what role can I play? How can I, in my sphere, push back against harmful ideas and promote life and truth? And that's exactly the kind of response the creators hoped for. And look, the film doesn't shy away from complexity. It talks about the ways in which ideas like abortion and sexual liberation didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were part of broader ideological currents, often tied to deeply held philosophical or political beliefs. It also shows how these currents have tangible effects on real lives, which is sometimes missing in academic discussions. By weaving together narrative, history, and moral reasoning, the 1916 Project makes these abstract concepts tangible. You watch it, and it hits you. This isn't just a debate about a law. It's about how society values life, how ideas shape culture, and how moral clarity, or the lack of it, has real consequences for people, families, and generations. One thing I find fascinating is how the project blends story with analysis. It's not just a list of facts or dates. It's storytelling at its best. Characters, tension, moral stakes, and consequences. And it makes history feel alive, like something that's not just in the past, but is actively influencing the present. That storytelling approach helps people connect emotionally as well as intellectually. They start seeing history not as a set of dusty events, but as a living narrative that impacts the world we live in today. And that's crucial if you want people to really internalize the lessons and be motivated to act. The screenings themselves became almost like community events. Churches didn't just host them, they became hubs for discussion, reflection, and planning. People would come in, watch the film, and then stay to talk about what they'd learned. They'd discuss how the church could respond more effectively, how families could be educated, and how communities could be mobilized. The film sparked conversations that were both deep and practical, and that's part of why it spread so quickly. Word of mouth, combined with the relevance and clarity of the content, made the 1916 Project more than just a documentary. It became a movement, a catalyst for cultural awareness and action. And honestly, I think part of what makes it so compelling is the way it respects the audience. It doesn't talk down to people. It assumes that viewers can handle complexity, can understand nuance, and can grapple with difficult moral questions. And when you treat people that way, when you trust their ability to think critically, they respond, they engage, they ask questions, they become part of the conversation rather than just passive consumers of information. And that's a huge reason why the 1916 Project resonated so deeply across so many churches and communities. So to sum up, the 1916 Project is about education, moral clarity, and empowerment. It connects history, ideology, and modern cultural issues in a way that's accessible, compelling, and deeply relevant. It reminds the church of its role as a moral guide, provides context for understanding modern debates over life, family, and human dignity, and inspires viewers to take action in their own communities. The screenings, the reception, and the ongoing discussions all highlight just how powerful a well-told story can be when it's grounded in truth, history, and moral conviction. People walk away not just informed, but challenged, motivated, and frankly, a little bit inspired to step up and engage with the world around them in a meaningful way. It's about reclaiming knowledge, understanding the roots of modern culture, and figuring out how to respond with courage, clarity, and conviction. And the best part, once you start connecting the dots, you realize that understanding the past isn't just interesting. It's essential if you want to make a difference today and for the future. Alright, so let's really dig into the philosophical and legal foundations of the pro-life position. And I want to keep this natural, like we're just chatting, because it can get heavy, but it's also essential to understand. So first, let's talk about personhood. What does it actually mean to be a person? I mean, you might think, well, obvious, right? But when you peel back the layers, it's really complex. Some people say it's about consciousness, or IQ, or the ability to feel pain, or self-awareness. Okay, sure, those things matter, but here's the problem. All of those things exist in degrees. Not everyone has the same IQ, not everyone is equally conscious in every way. And if you make personhood dependent on those fluctuating qualities, suddenly rights aren't equal. Some people are more of a person than others, based on arbitrary criteria. And that's the slippery slope that the pro-life argument warns against. The pro-life position starts with a simple but profound claim. From conception, there's a distinct, living human being. And if that's true, then there's no meaningful difference between that human in the womb and the human outside the womb, philosophically. The argument is about consistency. You can't say, this one counts, this one doesn't. If you truly value human life, you have to value it equally, no matter what stage of development it's in. That's what equal rights protection means in this context. It's not a political slogan, it's a principle grounded in morality and logic. Now, let's take that idea and translate it into law. Here's where it gets really interesting. Say a state passes a law making abortion illegal. What happens if someone breaks that law? Well, the pro-life argument is that the legal consequences for ending the life of an unborn child should match the consequences for ending the life of a child outside the womb. That's straightforward consistency. If you kill a 1-month-old baby, society rightly responds with investigation, prosecution, and punishment. Why would it be any different for a newborn in the womb? Equal rights protection means the law treats all human life the same, regardless of location or development stage. And yet, here's where things get complicated in practice. Federal versus state laws can create a patchwork of protections. Some states have made abortion illegal with strict enforcement. Others have made it legal under various circumstances. So, enforcing equal rights isn't just about passing a law, it's about applying it consistently where the law already exists. Without enforcement, the principle is meaningless. It's like having speed limits on the road, but no police to enforce them. People just keep breaking the law. And in the case of abortion, the consequences are real, irreversible, and tragic. So enforcement isn't just legal nitpicking, it's the mechanism that gives meaning to the moral principle of personhood. Now, let's talk about federal protections, specifically the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. This legislation is meant to ensure that if a baby survives an abortion attempt, it is legally recognized as a person and protected under the law. Sounds basic, right? You'd think that if a baby is breathing, has a heartbeat, and is alive, society would immediately step in. But for decades, this bill has been blocked or vetoed repeatedly. That means babies can survive these procedures and still not have guaranteed legal protection. That's shocking, and it really underscores why equal rights protection and enforcement matter so much. Without legal teeth, philosophical arguments are just words on a page. And there's a lot of misunderstanding around criminalization. People often think pro-lifers want to throw mothers in jail or punish them harshly. That's not the point. The goal is to hold accountable those who are ending human life in violation of the law. It's about consistency and protection, not cruelty. In practice, that could mean focusing legal consequences on providers, while offering support, counseling, and resources for mothers. The key is that the law treats the unborn child as a person, and violations are met with appropriate consequences. Otherwise, you've got laws that say one thing and a culture that does another, which is exactly what creates moral confusion. Now, you might be wondering, okay, but what about the real-life implications? Well, there are documented cases where abortion providers and staff allowed infants who survived abortion procedures to die, or worse, actively killed them and faced no consequences. That's horrifying. And it illustrates why enforcement matters so much. Philosophical claims about personhood and rights only have force if they're backed up by law and legal action. Without consequences, society effectively condones the behavior. And that's precisely why pro-life advocates emphasize equal protection and accountability. Let's step back a little and look at the broader philosophical implications. If the law doesn't recognize the unborn as persons, what precedent does that set? It creates a hierarchy of human value, where some lives are legally and morally protected and others aren't. And that's dangerous. It's not just about abortion, it affects how society views life in general. If one group of humans can be denied legal protection, what's to stop the logic from being extended elsewhere? This is the core of the pro-life argument. Consistency matters. Rights are only meaningful if they apply equally. Anything less undermines the foundation of human dignity. And enforcement also sends a powerful societal message. Aristotle famously said that statecraft is soulcraft. The law shapes the moral conscience of the public. If the law treats some lives as expendable, it teaches society that human life can be devalued. Conversely, if laws consistently protect life, they reinforce the moral weight of the principle. So, equal rights protection isn't just about individual cases, it's about cultural and moral education. The legal system isn't just enforcing rules, it's teaching the population about what's right and wrong. That's why penalties and consistent enforcement are central to the pro-life position. Now, consider generational impact. Millennials, Gen Z, and subsequent generations are growing up in a society where abortion has been normalized for decades. Roe versus Wade and similar legal precedents treated abortion as a right, integrated it into public education, and shaped social norms. When something is normalized like that, it influences how young people perceive life, personhood, and responsibility. That's why pro-life advocates are so concerned with both legal and educational efforts. Without them, generations grow up with a distorted understanding of human dignity, making the enforcement of principles even more critical. And let's be clear, this isn't just theoretical. Enforcement, or the lack thereof, has practical consequences. If abortion laws exist but are unenforced, the principle of personhood is undermined. People get the message that laws protecting life aren't serious. That's why discussions around the Bornalive Act, state enforcement, and federal consistency are so central. It's not about legal technicalities, it's about protecting human life and making sure the moral and legal frameworks align. The pro-life position also emphasizes the consistency of moral reasoning. You can't cherry-pick which humans are persons based on convenience, development stage, or dependency. If you value human life, that value must extend to every human being equally. And if the law doesn't reflect that, society loses credibility in defending life anywhere. This is why the pro-life movement often frames its argument in terms of philosophy, legal consistency, and practical consequences. It's a comprehensive approach that addresses both the moral and societal dimensions of the issue. And this philosophy has ripple effects beyond just abortion. It shapes society's understanding of human rights, dignity, and justice. If we fail to recognize and protect the unborn consistently, it creates a precedent for valuing life based on arbitrary characteristics. That can impact how we treat the elderly, the disabled, or anyone deemed inconvenient by cultural or political forces. The pro-life argument isn't just about one stage of life, it's about establishing a principle of equal value that applies universally. Another important angle is education. Laws alone aren't enough. Society needs to understand why these laws exist and why they're enforced. That's where moral reasoning and philosophical clarity come in. People need to see that protecting the unborn is consistent with broader principles of justice and human dignity. Without that understanding, enforcement can feel punitive or arbitrary, and the moral foundation erodes. Education and legal consistency go hand in hand. And let's talk about the practical side again. In a state where abortion is illegal, if someone violates that law, there must be consequences, investigation, prosecution, and appropriate punishment. Without that, the law is symbolic at best, and in the case of abortion, the stakes are irreversible. That's why pro-life advocates stress the need for equal treatment under the law, not just for moral clarity, but to actually protect lives. It's a practical extension of the philosophical argument. At the federal level, protections like the Bornalive Act are supposed to provide a baseline. Without federal consistency, you end up with a patchwork where some lives are legally protected and others aren't. That's why federal action combined with state enforcement is crucial. It ensures that all human life is recognized and that violations carry consequences. Otherwise, the principle of personhood is undermined, and society sends mixed messages about the value of life. And here's a point that's often overlooked. Criminalization doesn't mean punishing the mother harshly. It's about enforcing laws in a way that is fair and consistent, often targeting providers or those who actively end life while providing support and resources for the mother. The law should be a reflection of moral clarity, not a tool for cruelty. That's why legal consistency and equal protection are central. They provide real-world validation of the philosophical principle that life matters equally from conception onward. Think about it. If the law recognizes unborn children as persons and enforces that recognition, it teaches society something fundamental. It teaches that life is valuable, that human beings have inherent dignity, and that moral principles are not optional. Conversely, if the law fails to enforce these protections, society learns that life is conditional, that rights can be negotiated, and that moral principles are flexible. That's why enforcement isn't just a bureaucratic detail, it's central to the entire philosophical and cultural argument. And, practically speaking, the pro-life position also addresses generational and societal education. Millennials and Gen Z have largely grown up in a society that normalized abortion. Laws and culture have intertwined to shape social norms. Without active legal and educational measures, these generations may continue to see abortion as unremarkable. That's why legal consistency, education, and public discourse are all critical parts of the pro-life strategy. It's about shaping a culture that values life across generations. In short, the pro-life position is a combination of philosophy, law, and practical ethics. Personhood is the foundation, equal rights protection is the framework, and enforcement ensures that the principles are real, meaningful, and consistent. Without any one of these elements, the system falls apart. And that's why pro-life advocates focus not just on individual cases or political battles, but on building a coherent, consistent approach that aligns moral principles, legal standards, and practical enforcement. It's a holistic approach aimed at protecting life, educating society, and establishing a lasting moral foundation. And when you see it laid out that way, Mondes, it's clear why personhood, equal rights, and consequences are so central, not just for abortion, but for the moral integrity of society as a whole. Okay, so let's talk about normamccorvey, also known as Jane Roe, the woman whose case led to the infamous Roe versus Wade decision in 1973. Now, this story is complicated, emotional, and honestly a little heartbreaking, but it's also important for understanding the real human consequences behind legal battles and cultural shifts. Norma wasn't just a name in a Supreme Court case, she was a real person with fears, struggles, and dreams, and her story gives us a window into how legal systems and cultural ideologies can use people as pawns. So, back in 1970, Norma was pregnant for the third time. She wasn't married, she was struggling financially, and she was really unsure about what to do with this pregnancy. And here's the thing, she didn't have support. She wasn't given options for practical help, like financial assistance, vocational guidance, or even counseling. Instead, her lawyers approached her in a very calculated way, but they were looking for a young, unmarried woman to serve as a test case to challenge the laws around abortion in Texas. They weren't thinking about her life, her well-being, or her future. Norma later reflected on this and said that she felt used. She was a real human being caught up in a legal and political experiment, much like a pawn in a larger game. In 1995, many years later, Norma gave her life to Christ and she began to oppose abortion publicly. She shared her story with honesty and vulnerability, which is what makes it so powerful. In 2005, she testified before a subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and her words were raw, reflective, and deeply personal. She said, quote, "I am the woman once known as the Jane Roe of Roe versus Wade, but I dislike the name Jane Roe and all that it stands for. I am a real person named normamccorvey, and I want you to know the horrible and evil things that Roe versus Wade did to me and others." Think about that for a second. Like, she's speaking not just about herself, but about millions of others affected by the decision. She felt the weight of being used, manipulated, and misunderstood, and she wanted to make sure her story was heard in her own voice. She explained that her lawyers never informed her that choosing abortion would involve ending a human life. She said, "My lawyers did not tell me that I would be killing a human being. My lawyers did not inform me about life-changing consequences of this decision." That's heavy, right? It's one thing to hear abstract legal arguments or statistics, but hearing it from someone who lived through it, someone who later recognized the truth, hits differently. She went on to reflect on the emotional and psychological consequences of being part of this case. She said, quote, "While I was once an advocate for abortion, like many women who choose to participate in abortion, my lawyers did not tell me that I would later come to deeply regret that I was partially responsible for killing 40 to 50 million human beings." Wow, that's a staggering number, and it shows the scope of impact that one legal decision can have when amplified across society. Norma's words remind us that these are not just theoretical debates. They have real, tangible effects on human lives and moral conscience. Norma also spoke about the personal toll of this experience, saying that the grief and emotional weight she carried was like a living hell. She recognized that she had been used by a legal system that prioritized experimentation over human dignity, and she wrestled with her role in what became a national tragedy in her eyes. Yet, she didn't stop at regret. She sought redemption and action. In 1995, she asked for forgiveness from the Lord and dedicated her life to saving children and women from the very circumstances she had been caught in. Her journey is one of transformation, reflection, and moral awakening. In her testimony, she also highlighted the broader societal implications of Roe versus Wade. She explained that abortion is not a simple medical procedure, it's the killing of a human being, and it carries severe psychological and emotional consequences. She urged lawmakers to consider their own consciences and to recognize the moral gravity of allowing this practice to continue unchecked. She said, quote, "We must ask Almighty God to forgive us for what we have done. We must repent of our actions as a nation in allowing this Holocaust to come to our shores." Her language was strong, but it reflects the depth of conviction and moral clarity she reached after years of reflection. One of the most powerful aspects of Norma's story is that it humanizes a legal and cultural debate that can often feel abstract. Roe versus Wade is frequently discussed in terms of rights, legal precedents, and court decisions. But Norma's experience reminds us that these legal abstractions affect real human beings. She wasn't a statistic, she wasn't a concept, she was a living, breathing person. And the decisions made in courts and by lawmakers had profound consequences for her and for countless others. Norma also shared how she was guided in her later life by mentors and pro-life activists, including the Benham brothers, who helped her see the value of life and the possibility of making amends by advocating for others. She was baptized, discipled, and dedicated herself to working against abortion, demonstrating the profound personal transformation that can occur when someone confronts the truth about their past actions and chooses to engage in restorative action. Her story is one of redemption, but also a cautionary tale about the dangers of being used by systems without awareness or moral guidance. What's really striking about her story is the long-term perspective. She lived through the legal, the cultural, and personal consequences of being part of Roe versus Wade. She experienced the manipulation, the lack of support, and the societal pressures, and she reflected deeply on the impact not just on herself, but on millions of others. That reflection led her to a profound moral and spiritual awakening, which she then turned into action, advocacy, and education. It's a reminder that understanding history, culture, and the consequences of legal decisions isn't just academic, it's deeply personal and morally urgent. Norma's journey also underscores the importance of personal agency and conscience. She wasn't forced to take a moral stand later in life, but she chose to confront the consequences of her earlier experiences, seek forgiveness, and dedicate herself to helping others. Her story illustrates that understanding the moral and philosophical foundations of life, personhood, and human dignity is essential for making informed decisions and advocating for justice. It's a lesson that goes beyond abortion. It's about understanding how legal and cultural systems can shape human behavior and moral responsibility. And there's a broader lesson here for all of us. Norma's story shows how legal decisions can ripple through society in ways that are often unseen at first. Roe versus Wade didn't just change the law, it changed social norms, expectations, and moral perceptions across generations. It's a reminder that law, culture, and morality are deeply interconnected. When the law fails to protect the most vulnerable, society as a whole suffers. And when individuals are used as instruments of legal or political agendas, the personal cost can be immense. Normamccorvey's testimony reminds us to consider the human element behind every legal decision. Another key takeaway from her story is the role of support and guidance. If Norma had been given genuine support, financial, emotional, and spiritual, her early life decisions might have been very different. She highlighted that her lawyers were focused on creating a test case rather than helping her navigate her situation. That lack of support amplified the harm and contributed to her sense of being used. This underscores the importance of compassionate, principled guidance in navigating morally complex situations. And it's a reminder that societal systems need to prioritize human dignity and care, not just legal strategy. Norma also emphasizes personal responsibility and reflection. Even though she was used by the legal system, she later acknowledged her role and sought to make amends. She said, quote, "I have to accept my role in the deaths of millions of babies." That's heavy, right? But it's a testament to her moral clarity and the courage it takes to confront past actions, acknowledge consequences, and dedicate oneself to restorative action. Her journey isn't just about regret, it's about transformation, advocacy, and teaching others about the importance of understanding human dignity from conception onward. Her story also illustrates the power of testimony. By sharing her experience with lawmakers, with the public, and in pro-life advocacy, Norma became a powerful voice for change. She took a personal narrative that had been used to advance a legal agenda and turned it into a moral lesson for society. Her words were raw, personal, and reflective, making the abstract consequences of Roe versus Wade tangible when she said, quote, "Abortion is not a simple medical procedure that is safer than childbirth. It is the killing of a human being. It produces severe psychological and emotional consequences." She was speaking from direct experience and observation. That's what gives her testimony its weight. And here's the broader connection. Norma's story helps us understand why cultural and legal decisions matter. The law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It shapes culture, behavior, and moral understanding. Roe versus Wade didn't just impact legal precedent, it influenced how millions of people perceive human life, personhood, and moral responsibility. Norma's life illustrates the human cost of abstract legal decisions, and it emphasizes the need for both ethical reflection and practical enforcement of laws that protect life. Ultimately, Norma McCorvey's journey is about transformation, accountability, and advocacy. She moved from being a pawn in a legal battle to becoming an advocate for life, using her experience to educate and inspire others. Her testimony is a powerful reminder that the philosophical, moral, and legal dimensions of life are intertwined, and that understanding the consequences of cultural and legal decisions requires empathy, reflection, and courage. By listening to her story, we can see the real-world impact of abstract principles and recognize the importance of protecting life at every stage. It's a story that challenges us to think deeply about personhood, responsibility, and the human consequences of law and policy. And it's a story that continues to resonate today. Okay, so let's talk about Planned Parenthood. And I want to be really clear here. This isn't just about abortion. I mean, yeah, they're the biggest provider of abortions in the US, but their reach goes way beyond that. They've been heavily involved in comprehensive sex education in schools, teaching everything from contraceptives to, well, some really controversial stuff around gender and sexuality. And now, they're even pushing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for young people who are confused about their gender. It's a lot, and honestly, it can be kind of shocking when you realize just how far their influence goes. But here's the thing, this didn't start yesterday. There's a historical context you can't ignore. Go back to the early 20th century, and you see people like Margaret Sanger, who founded the organization that became Planned Parenthood. She was involved in the eugenics movement, and she was very explicit about wanting to control the population in ways that targeted minority communities. That's part of the reason the organization has such a complicated legacy. And even before that, there was Alfred Kinsey, whose research on human sexuality in the mid-20th century heavily influenced American sexual education. Now, Kinsey's studies were controversial, to say the least. He based a lot of his findings on interviews with people who were sexually abusing children, rapists, and criminals. I mean, yeah, it's horrifying, but that's part of the foundation for the modern sex education curriculum that Planned Parenthood helped implement. So, when you look at it, the Planned Parenthood's work isn't just medical, it's social engineering in a sense. They've created a whole system where they influence what kids learn in schools, what kind of medical care they get, and even the policies that shape their communities. And now, they're actively working to place allies on school boards and fund campaigns for people who will support their agenda. That means they're not just providing services, they're shaping policy, culture, and the next generation's worldview. It's strategic, and, well, it's pretty far-reaching when you step back and look at it. And let's talk about the numbers, because it puts things in perspective. They're the largest provider of comprehensive sexuality education in America. They kill about a third of all children in the U.S. each year through abortion. And now, as of last year, they announced they're the second largest provider of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for youth. That's not a small operation. They're systematically influencing education, healthcare, and policy to align with their agenda. And it's not just abortion, it's about ideology, control over education, and reshaping social norms. That's why people need to understand the full scope, not just the headlines. So, when you hear about Planned Parenthood, think beyond the clinics. Think about the curriculum in schools, the influence on legislation, and the way they're shaping how children understand sex, gender, and identity. And yeah, it's controversial for a reason. Because these aren't just minor choices, they're shaping minds, bodies, and beliefs at a formative age. And when you connect that to their historical roots with Keynesian eugenics, it's a pattern that spans decades. It's not just medical services, it's a cultural and social agenda that's far more comprehensive than most people realize. Alright, let's bring this full circle and talk about Christian resistance today, and why it's more relevant than ever. You see, the same principles that guided early believers and movements like the White Rose in Munich still apply. The White Rose Resistance, as it exists now, is focused on awakening the church to its historic role in standing against cultural evils and defending life. Their mission is to mobilize believers, not just to talk about faith, but to actively engage in protecting the most vulnerable and pushing back against forces that threaten human dignity. And here's the thing, they do this through both education and action. They produce films like the 1916 Project that teach the history and ideological roots of modern social challenges. But they also train believers practically, giving people tools and knowledge to engage effectively in their communities. It's about empowering everyday Christians to understand the battles being fought culturally and spiritually, and to take meaningful steps to protect life. It's not just theoretical, it's hands-on. And yes, that can include advocacy, activism, and being a voice for the voiceless. Now, part of this approach is recognizing the twofold duty of pastors. Pastors aren't just there to preach and build up their congregations. Important as that is, they also have a responsibility to defend. Think of it like this. You're building a wall with TR, teaching, shepherding, encouraging your people, but you also need the sword, the tools to protect, to stand firm when evil comes knocking. That's why the White Rose Resistance emphasizes both building and defending. You can't have a strong church if you only build and never defend the truth. And you can't defend effectively if you haven't first built up the people spiritually and morally. So, when we talk about activism, it's not about chaos or shouting into the void. It's strategic, intentional, and rooted in moral clarity. The White Rose Resistance trains people to engage thoughtfully and courageously, whether it's advocating for the unborn, standing against the sexualization of children, or promoting policies that protect human dignity. And it's not just about public displays, it's also about equipping Christians to lead in everyday life, to model truth and virtue, and to take principled stands in their communities. The idea is to have believers fully informed, spiritually grounded, and ready to act when necessary. And that's where the sense of urgency comes in. Look around. The cultural landscape is shifting fast. There are real threats to life, to family, and to moral clarity, and the church can't sit on the sidelines. Standing for life, standing against cultural decay, isn't optional. It's part of living faithfully. The White Rose Resistance exists to put themselves out of a job, in a sense. They want the church to reclaim its role fully, so that every believer is aware, active, and empowered to make a difference. And that's inspiring, right? Because it's not about a few people doing all the work. It's about mobilizing the whole body of believers. The training they provide is also practical. It teaches how to engage in activism while maintaining grace, how to educate others without creating unnecessary conflict, and how to combine advocacy with compassion. This equips believers to navigate complex cultural issues without being overwhelmed or paralyzed. And it emphasizes that the work isn't just about opposing bad things, it's also about affirming good, promoting life, and building a culture that respects human dignity at every stage. So, to sum it up, Christian resistance today is about waking up the church to its historical role, giving believers the tools to act, and ensuring that pastors fulfill their dual duty of building and defending. It's strategic, it's intentional, and it's empowering. And here's the takeaway. Every believer has a role to play. Whether it's speaking up, educating others, volunteering, or leading by example, you can be part of this movement. The White Rose Resistance shows that courage, clarity, and action can create ripple effects across society. And honestly, the call is urgent, because standing for life, for truth, and for human dignity isn't just important, it's essential. The church must rise, and when it does, change is possible. It's a challenge, sure, but it's also an incredible opportunity to make a real difference in the world we live in. Thanks for sticking with me through this video. I hope it's given you some things to think about, not just about laws or history, but about the value of every human life and our role in protecting it. If this sparked curiosity or moved you, take a moment to explore, reflect, and maybe even get involved in your community. Every small action counts, and together, we can make a real difference. Keep asking questions, learning, and standing for what matters.